Welcome to the Diversity Connector podcast, where we explore the rich tapestry of human experiences. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and together as we dive into conversations that bridge cultures, challenge stereotypes, and celebrate the unique perspectives each of us brings to the table. Each episode is a journey through stories and insights from a kaleidoscope of voices, each sharing their colorful narrative. Whether you're at home, on the go, or just anywhere in between, you're now part of a community that values understanding, inclusivity, and the beauty of diversity. So plug in your headphones, get comfortable, and let's connect through the power of our shared stories. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on the Diversity Connector podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Diversity Connector. This is Gertrude Mache here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And today I am graced with the presence of yet another fascinating young woman. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our tribe. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, and share your story with us today. Oops.
Hi, my name is Alisha Andrews. I am based in Aurora, Colorado. I am a practitioner of organizational development with an equity focus, and I have been doing this work for it's been about 10 years now. So I grew up in Colorado. I was born in Nevada, and my dad was on a contract when I was born, but I was raised in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And I started really getting involved in my community probably about at the age of 10. And so my parents kind of pushed me out of the house as often as possible and told me to use whatever skills I had to give back to my community, to support my community. And so the first thing that I started to do was I started something relatively benign, which was like face painting at the YMCA during any of the festivals. And that's how I volunteered in my community. And so as I got started from there, I saw the joy that people experience from that. And I began to grow in the ways in which I would advocate. So I went from there to being on a teen advisory group, to leading our basketball team as a captain. And then I got into politics. And that's when my life really kind of changed, because that's when I really started focusing on, I guess, adult matters is what I call them, and recognizing the differences in the ways that I was treated based off of the different identities that I had. When I was around 12 years old, my mom passed away from cancer, from cervical cancer. And it was because she reached her lifetime maximum on her health insurance. And so around the time I turned 18 was around the time Barack Obama was running for president, and he had a similar story. His mother had died from the same kind of cancer for the same reason. And so it was something that pulled me in and made me really think about how do these inequities based off of your race, your class, your gender, your geographical location, how are they affecting our quality of life? And so I started volunteering with this campaign in two cities. I was in Fort Collins and in Colorado Springs. I was just hitting the pavement and hearing all these different people's stories consistently over and over again about how they didn't understand how a presidential election could affect them, or how it led to them moving from class to class, or from geographic location to geographic location, or how their needs were being met. So I kind of became interested in the equity work itself because of the ways that I heard so many different stories while working on that campaign. So once I got involved in my school, I started looking at the ways in which I went to what's called in the US a PWI, which is a predominantly white institution, the ways in which my education wasn't even given the best quality because of my race, my gender, my class, and how difficult it was for me to get through my bachelor's degree and the resources that just weren't set up for me to navigate that space. As well as at the same time, I started working in student health insurance. So I started learning more about insurance policies. And in that time period of working there, I learned more about how policy affects people and how policy affects people, how there are different instances of the ways in which people have access to healthcare. And a lot of it is based off of your class. And so that was upsetting to me. And knowing what had happened with my mother, I wanted to get into insurance. And I was like, this is going to be my way. This is going to be how I save the world. And then I realized working in insurance wasn't really where I found the power. Working outside of insurance as a lawmaker is what was going to give me that power. So I then started working on campaigns again, working to get people elected who I felt like were the right people for the roles that they were in. Then I started working in the US Senate, working on different sorts of bills for veterans, for communities of color, and really learning how to legislate and what it looks like at a systemic level to have these different sorts of issues that people are facing based off of whatever identity that they have that is just not dominantly represented in our country. I went from the Senate into some state work, working at the state on opioid bills. And then I went into nonprofits, working in health or working in higher education for equity in education. And then I took on a role at a local museum here called the Denver Art Museum, doing the work of equity and employee experience within the organization. Around 2020, I was starting to get really a handle on what passion I really had. And I got to the point of thinking around like, what are the things that are exciting me? And a lot of that was around how do organizations work? We spend a lot of our time at work. We spend a lot of our life at work. And how is the marginalization that exists within organizations creating negative health outcomes and negative quality of life. So I started studying a master's degree in leadership, executive leadership and organizational development, and really kind of fostered my thoughts around how organizations work and why organizations work the way they work and who is benefited by these organizations working in the way that they work. And so I've spent the rest of my career since then, the past 4 years, of looking at organizations specifically, the way that they function, and how to infuse equity throughout the entire organization, as opposed to just looking at it from a perspective of just DEI on its own, a standalone, separate programming sort of structure. Instead, looking at this as to how does this look at the macro level for organizations. And so I started a consulting company about 6 months ago called WorkHype. And the focus on that is to look at what makes people happy at work. How do we change culture at work? What are some of those tried and true best practices that organizations may or may not be employing within their organization and their rules of engagement with each other so that they can become better? It could become a racially safe space for people, and it can support people's professional development and growth. So that is kind of how I ended up here. And that's how my career journey has met. And that's my story.
Wow. What an incredible life you've had, and my sincere condolences for the passing of your mom.
Thank you.
You know, this is such a common story that we hear from time and time again. It's the lack of resources affecting somebody's life in that way. People dying way too early just because of the lack of health care.
Yeah.
So Now, how do you describe your role as the Director of Equity and Employment Experience at Denver Art Museum, and how it intersects with promoting diversity within the organization?
Yeah, so my role really is an organizational development role in itself. It focuses on every aspect of the employee life cycle and all of the systems that affects the employees. And so my role really focuses on how do we change the culture of the organization while also providing safety for people throughout the psychological safety for people throughout the course of that change. And how do we look at that? My background and expertise is in anti-racism. And so how do we look at that from a race-based perspective? How do we tackle anti-Blackness, indigenous erasure, Asian erasure, tokenism, all of these things that pop up within the workplace or within hiring processes or within processes themselves, and looking at the intersectionality of all of that with other isms that you can face within the workplace. And so it's a big role, but I focus on those key areas, and I'm track and evaluate data based off of those key areas.
So let's look at the path to diversity leadership.
Mm-hmm.
What motivated you to focus your career on equity, diversity, and inclusion, particularly within the context of a cultural institution like the Denver Art Museum?
Well, I never thought about working at a museum before, because I have had my career has mostly consisted of these really, and it's not that my job isn't serious, because it is very serious and lives are involved, but these really high pressure, high intense jobs that are like politics and infighting and all of those things that you see on TV, but also what's happening on the ground. That's been the consistency of my career, is working in those sorts of environments. So it wasn't anything that I had considered, and it wasn't something I was seeking out. I had saw a position open, and I knew this was my next step for myself.
Yeah.
And I talked to people in the community before I applied, because I think every practitioner in this work knows that like the organization is what's going to make or break the role, especially a role like this. And people in the community shared that they felt like the Denver Art Museum was really focused on this work, and they had experienced it being a focus of theirs and a priority. And so I applied, and I was fortunate to get the role. And then from there, that evolved into my consulting role, my consulting business that I have, which I do similar work for organizations, but just on the outside. And I support other organizations in their evolution and on their journey. But mostly the motivation has been behind the impact, because I know how difficult it can be, especially existing as a Black woman in all those spaces. And now being able to actually use that experience and that power to change and make impact, not just at my current role and my current job, but also at other organizations.
So, how has your background in social work and experience in community outreach contributed to your approach to building a more inclusive museum environment?
It has. I did not realize how helpful it was going to be, actually, because like I said, I struggled through college. For my undergraduate, I struggled through there. And so I was like, I just need to pick something that I know I can get a job with when I leave, and that is going to be easy enough for me to stay engaged for the next 3 years. And social work was that for me. And so I wasn't expecting to use that degree at all. Or the work that I've done in the community, I kind of fell into that by finding a passion that I didn't know I had. But I've learned that any system change has to start with some sort of grassroots movement. And it has to, you have to have influence, you have to win partners, and you have to power map. And those were very important pieces and elements that I learned from social work and community organizing, that led me to the point of being able to go into organizations, quickly build rapport, understand the larger scale issues, understand how to connect these things that are happening on the ground to larger scale initiatives, and to make people understand why it matters. And so those were all things that I've learned in both of those. So I'm really grateful that I stumbled into my path, but it wasn't ever anything that I like set out to do in any case.
So, can you share an example of a coalition that you've built that has had a significant impact on promoting diversity and inclusion within the museum or the wider community?
Yeah, so one of the bigger things, and it was sort of built before I got there. There was a D&I committee when I first got to the museum,
Right.
and then we switched it to a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee.
Right.
And from that committee, we learned that there were other communities that need support. So we were able to create additional communities, is what I like to call them, within the museum that focus on groups of people who identify as people of color, so that they can share their any sort of challenges or any sort of barriers that they face based off of being people of color within a predominantly white institution,
Yes.
as well as for people who just want to learn better allyship. It's called communities of practice, where people get together and just have conversations around the work that we have done internally. When I got there, I authored a 8-hour training for everyone with books and things, and so we're doing follow up to that through that communities of practice. So there's two new areas that we're able to engage people to continue the work. And then in the community, it was really more of an informal thing that we started, but a friend and I had talked about how there's always space for you to be a woman in business. There's always space for you to be a professional in business, but there's never a space for you to be Black. And so specifically in Colorado, where we're at, it's a predominantly white state. And so oftentimes you are spending most of your time masking. And so we created this group. We called it the FUBU Happy Hour. And it was for Black women to get together to exist in their element in whatever capacity or whatever spectrum of Blackness they felt like they represent.
Right.
Feeling pressured to say the right thing, do the right thing. And so it was a happy hour that we held it was about 3 years that we held that happy hour. And it created tons of friendships, tons of connections. And a lot of the things that we hear, that I hear from Black people who move to Denver for work, is that it's difficult to find a community. And so within that, we were able to build community for many women who just didn't have the community that they felt like they needed in order to want to stay in Colorado.
So, how do you approach the challenge of transcending cultural differences to foster an inclusive workplace and museum experience?
Well, I usually try and look at where are the similarities first. So I like to explain to people, like, and not because it's all the same, it's not the same experience, you're not going to hold it in your body the same way. But if you know that it can happen, that means that you can recognize that it does happen. And so if you have an experience of feeling marginalized at any point, and oftentimes when I talk to leaders who are white and are male, I explain to them, like, have you ever thought about how difficult it is for you to say something without scrutiny?
Mm-hmm.
You can imagine that that's how most of the marginalized employees. So I try and get everyone to a common ground. Like, you have had this experience before. It, however, does not serve as a barrier to you advancing in your career. It does not prevent you from being trusted. It does not take away your power when it happens to you. And so having that basic understanding is one of the ways that we do this. And then we talk a lot about allyship. And that's something that I like to talk about, is more in solidarity versus allyship, but what solidarity looks like. So when people have privilege, they have to recognize it. So everybody has a bit of privilege. And so knowing how you can utilize that strategically in the right moments with the energy that you have in place, knowing how to use that, it supports any demographic, any marginalized group. So everybody understanding both sides of that coin, and not looking at it from the point of view of, like, you're fully privileged, you're all privileged, but knowing where you do have privilege, or where people do trust you, or where people do listen to you. And that's what I like to talk with my clients about, as well as at the Denver Art Museum.
So what strategies have you implemented to enhance equity and employee experience at Denver Museum?
Mm-hmm.
And what outcomes have you observed?
Yeah, so what I think are the best, what I choose to be my best practices in this is that after 2020, there were a lot of organizations that wanted to just push people of color into roles wherever they may be. It was more about like, how many people of color can we have, and how many are we going to get? Not necessarily about retention, not necessarily about the culture change. And so the work that I do at the Denver Art Museum and with clients is really focused on how do we support people in culture change? Because that's what makes people want to come to work and want to stay at work. If you're experiencing microaggressions in the workplace, that's not going to create an outcome. So when I came in, I was charged with creating a strategy. And I often do this work with other companies as well. And lots of times, organizations in general always want to put a number to something. And so it's encouraging them to put a number to measuring culture versus measuring people, because that's tokenizing. So I always push in any instance, wherever I have the privilege of influencing a strategy, is the skills of DEI have to be a priority in your hiring if you want to change the culture of your organization. And that has to be the number one deciding factor as to whether you hire somebody or not the color of their skin, because we're all from an oppressed system, and we all have the same mind when we walk into it. Globally, it's a conversation that we should have, is that like, we're all born into a system of white supremacy because of colonization. And so you cannot expect people to want to stay in your workforce if you're experiencing racist, sexist, ableist, any sort of ist at work. Like, you can't expect people to want to be there. But if managers especially have the skills already to provide support when that happens, then it makes a difference. It makes a huge difference. And so when we measured this, we see that managers who have more training in DEI and are more committed to DEI work tend to have better retention. And that's what it shows, because they know how to support people when they're experiencing things that may not have anything to do with their job, but everything to do with the organization and its culture. Yes. And that's what the most important thing is. And I think that's what people have to focus on.
So how does Denver Art Museum ensure diversity in its art collections, exhibitions, and programming? And what role do you play in this process?
Yeah, so what we do at the Denver Art Museum is we have a few advisory committees that focus on approving our acquisitions. So we get input from the community before we acquire art. We also have, it's so complicated. I'm trying to figure out the words. I'm not an art person, but but the process is really around like building our collections for storytelling. And so one of the things that we've done in the past year is start something called the Black Arts Collective. And so that focuses on collecting work from the diaspora, of the African diaspora. And so we have a group of people who raise money to make sure that we're able to acquire art from the Black community globally. And so we have lots of groups that are specifically like that to support us in making sure that we meet those metrics. We also have internal values that we want to make sure that we're not just buying art from white men as well. Yes. So there's entire metrics that we have and rubrics that we have around that.
Fantastic. Wow. So let's talk about the challenges of diversity initiatives. What are some of the significant challenges that you face in advancing diversity and inclusion initiatives at Denver Art Museum, and how do you address them?
Well, I can speak to my general experience of at the Denver Art Museum and working with other clients. It's really around not limiting it to education. A lot of
Right.
times we spend too much time in the awareness stage and the
Yes.
change doesn't happen fast enough. And
Yes.
so that's what I've observed, like broadly working with organizations generally, is that there might be so much education that you may end up pushing people away from the organization
Right.
because there's no action. And so it's getting the courage to move into that brave space of making action, of speaking up when you see things happen, and I think that's where most organizations struggle in that sense.
All right. So, based on your experiences, what advice would you give individuals aspiring to lead diversity and inclusion efforts within cultural institutions or other organizations?
I think before going into a role like this, you have to have a set of boundaries for yourself.
Right.
And this probably isn't this probably isn't typical advice. Like there's the education piece, there's all those things that I'm sure many people have spoken to. But you have to have boundaries for yourself because the job will swallow you because it's so big. And a lot of the times people of color are the people who are in these roles. And so unlike any other leadership role that you may be in, your personhood is a part of it too.
Yes.
And so when you're hearing things and you're taking things in, you have to know that it's going to affect you outside of the workplace. It's going to create stress. It's going to create a different type of a different challenge for you in your personal life because of that. And so it's important to advocate for your benefits upon going into those roles, making sure that whatever institution that you are working at is paying for therapy, is paying for even advocating for extra vacation days, whatever it could be, extra mental health days, whatever that may be, because the difference between a DEI officer and like a chief marketing officer or whatever the title may be, senior vice president of whatever, is that your personhood isn't tied up in your role. And so when you are personally affected by it, that changes everything. And that's a different cost that you're paying. So knowing what your limits are, knowing what your boundaries are, knowing where your line is at is beyond important.
It's interesting you should say this because a lot of times we don't realize just how much the mental health aspect of dealing in it or working in a DEI space can have on an individual, correct?
Yeah.
Those things are taken for granted.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I don't know what it is in Australia, but in the US, the average tenure for someone in roles like these is 18 months. So it's not long. Like people aren't lasting very long in these roles in the US. And so it's important for people to go into these going into this knowing like what your values are and what you're willing to accept and what you aren't willing to accept and how you are going to make sure you stick to those boundaries. Because I feel like that's the most important thing to know before you go into a role like this.
Right. Yeah, so those boundaries can be crossed and it could end up costing you your health.
And it's not worth it. Unemployment is better than your health, than losing your health.
Oh my gosh. So my last question for you, or maybe second to last, is as a woman of color living in the United States, seeing where the trends are going and what the future can look like, is there any hope? Is there anything changing?
I think there's more than enough hope. I think the change is going to result in once we are able to personalize these stories and recognize how much inequity set us back, whether that is looking at the bottom line or even looking at the progress of our society, we are outpaced by spaces that don't have these problems at the height of the level. And so the US isn't the center of racism, but we play a big part in it, in the world. And there's so much more for people to offer and so much more for everyone to gain once we get there. So I think that the hope is there. Like, I know that there can be, like, it can be this. I think that the change is going to be the slowest part of it. As people move away from feeling like this is a threat to who I am, to understanding that this is a enhancement to who I am.
Yeah.
And once that is the clear message, once people truly understand that, because it takes so long to see change with DEI efforts,
Yes.
I think that we'll see more rapid change, and that's kind of how society works. But it's moving slow for sure.
So looking ahead, what are your future goals for enhancing diversity, equity, and inclusion at Denver Art Museum, and how do you plan to achieve them?
Yeah, so looking ahead, I am at the museum. I want to make sure the foundation's built. And so that takes a long time. It's a lot of work to build the foundation. So my goal is really to sort of get a great communication cadence for the staff so that they understand what's happening. I am hopeful that by the end of this, probably the next quarter, that I will have an entirely new recruitment process for our organization that reduces the workload on any candidate, but looking at it from the space of race, of knowing that it is going to create an opportunity for people who never thought about working at museums before. And I think internally, like, the data collection excites me. I think there's some excitement around even reporting out what changes have looked like, seeing the evolution of the way the staff feels about how they come into their workplace. And so all of that stuff is what's gotten started, and I'm looking forward to the next couple of years of being able to see what that ends like. And then for me personally, I am an impact person. And so I am just looking forward to being able to make impact at whatever level and reach as many people as possible, through consulting work or through things like these podcasts, or writing journals or doing research or any of that sort of stuff. Like, that's personally what I would like to do with the rest of my career, of being able to support people in that way and being able to make impact without having to be inside the system, but being able to do more in that way.
That is fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming online and sharing your story with us today. Absolutely love what you're doing in the space. We all need to be banding together, putting in our efforts to bring about change so that we can start celebrating the diversity of people in the world.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Alisha.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you to everybody who's come online today. The Diversity Connector is bringing you a wide range of perspectives from people from all over the world, celebrating our differences. So tune in again tomorrow when I interview yet another amazing guest. In the meantime, have a fantastic day, morning, or evening, wherever you are in the world, and bye for now. That's a wrap, everybody, on today's episode of the Diversity Connector podcast. Thank you for tuning in and being part of our vibrant and global conversation. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and it's been an honor to share this space with you, where voices from all walks of life come together to weave a tapestry of diverse perspectives. Remember, every story you've heard today is a thread in the larger fabric of our shared humanity. So, as you step back into your world, carry these stories with you and let them inspire you to embrace and celebrate the rich diversity around us. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast to help us share these inspiring stories with more listeners. Do follow us on social media by looking for the Diversity Connector podcast for more updates. Until then, keep connecting, keep listening, and keep celebrating the beauty of diversity. This is the Diversity Connector podcast signing off. Stay curious, stay open, and definitely stay connected.